Welcome to the Colony Archive, a weekly review and analysis on the politics of empire and resistance. Today we have with us the founder of PersianPoetics, Mohammad Ali Mojaradi, or if I want to anglicize his name, Mohammad Ali Mojaradi. In the social media space, he's also known as Sharkhzadeh. Mohammad Ali is the author of the book, The Flame of Love, Rumi's 100 Most Passionate Poems, which will be out in March of this year. I've known Mohammad Ali for a good part of a decade now, and he's one of the most genuine and passionate people I know who talks about Persian literature and Persian poetry. So stay with us and listen to our conversation about Persian literature and more. On this program, we talk a lot about Western imperialism, but then, to be fair, and also to, like we said, we want fairness and nuance. The peoples and the governments in our part of the world, meaning in West Asia, South Asia, Central Asia, they've also had empires. So before European colonial modernity and before European colonialism, we had empires too. So let's say the Muslims, there were a lot of Muslims empires. And so what you see in Iran today is that because we no longer have an empire, so the US is an empire, but we don't. So you see a lot of nostalgia over Iran's pre-modern and especially ancient, the Achaemenid tradition of imperialism. So there's a lot of nostalgia over that. And also with the Turks, in Turkey, I think you see a lot of nostalgia over the Ottoman Empire. Can you talk about this, especially because you work on Persian literature and you've probably encountered this, and also you travel a lot to the region. Do we have an imperialist complex?
I think we do, but not because we desire to go conquer places and Persianize them in reality. I think this is more of a reflection of our mindset and our psychological state. When you feel that the best is over, then the natural result is not to look to the future, then the natural result is to look to the past. So Turkey is a country that's in the Western orbit, it's in NATO, it can't actually really flex, it can only flex itself to a limit, right? It's in their context. So it helps the Turks to think about their glorious Ottoman past because they'll never live that in the future. They'll never have a moment where their borders stretch out, where their sphere of influence stretches out. And the same is true for Iranians to an extent. So we're not as restrained as Turkey, but we are restrained by material realities. So it's fun to think about a time when we were grand and we were powerful. Nations that are powerful in the contemporary age don't do that, right? So Americans don't reminisce about the past. They worry about crafting the future. And also it's important to recognize that pre-modern empires were just so different than not only empires in the modern age, such as a British and French and German empires, Italian empires, but especially empire today. So all three of those are incomparable. The pre-modern empires from 1,000 years ago to 3,000 years ago that we talk about, and then also the ones that happened in early modernity, and then the American empire of today. Each one of them is distinct. And I really think, frankly, the middle one, the modern, the kind of modernity emergent empires were the worst. The ones of France and Belgium and the UK and the Germans. Because at the very least with the American empire, if you totally, lose your will and your pride and your sense of self-determination, and you just say, okay, America, whatever you say, that shall come to pass, like many of the Arab states, at least you won't be destroyed. You'll be humiliated, you'll be subjugated, you'll lose your ability to craft your future, but you'll have some living, right? You'll be like a pet of the American empire. You'll be like a nicely treated dog or something like that,
I
like
think
a white person's dog,
the expropriation of land and people that happened, say, in the 19th century by the European empires, that was unprecedented in history. And I think you can't even compare the American empire to it.
Right, yeah. So at least the American empire, it reserves the really bad treatment for the people that fight against it, right? So if you're part of the empire, they won't destroy your country, right? They might not help you. They might keep you saddled with IMF loans, but they won't do what the British did to India, right? So modern empire is a bit more sophisticated. But generally, pre-modern empires were the softest, right? So you have a family comes, takes over institutions that exist. Like when the Arabs came to Iran, they just continued ruling Iran the way it was run. And Baghdad was run the way Iran was run, the Abbasids, right? Famously. And they can't extract resources simply because they're geographically limited. Right. So I think Babur, who ran the Mughal Empire in India, said, I would go back to Uzbekistan if I could, but I can't because it wasn't possible back then. There weren't planes and huge shipping lanes. Right. So if you're in India or you're in Iran or in Iraq, you're forced to build that place up. So whether the contemporary Indians like their Mughal heritage or not, the Taj Mahal was built in India. It wasn't built in Uzbekistan, where Babur was from. But the British, they didn't build Big Ben in India. They built Big Ben in the UK. So they took the material resources from India, they impoverished it, and then they processed those material resources in the Industrial Revolution in England, employing their people. And then they sent those back to India and sold them to the captive consumers. And then they took that money and they built the Big Ben. And they made London a beautiful city.
Yeah.
London shouldn't have been a beautiful city.
Yeah.
London's out there in the middle of nowhere. One last thing. Pre-modern Muslim empires didn't do this. The Muslims that ruled Iran, they built Iran. They didn't send the money off to Saudi Arabia. But anyway, go ahead.
No, I mean, I think the distinction you make between modern and pre-modern empires is very important. And I mean, this is not about identity either, that, well, you know, because the Westerners were doing it, it's worse, but it's just the nature of modernity and the new instruments and means that they have to run their empire. And I think they're qualitatively, as you say, they are very different.
Right, absolutely.
And I give you just one further clarification to your points. The pre-modern empires, I mean, they didn't intervene in people's everyday lives to the point that modern empires did. So going back to Persian and Persian literature, I mean, Persian might be the lingua franca or the language of the elite and the courts. So I say that it's the language of, you know, you mentioned Alamgir or Akbar, you know, the Mughal Empire. It's the language of the Safavids. But at the local and the vernacular level, they're speaking different languages, and that court language isn't necessarily imposed on people. Whereas the British, not just in their own region of the world, say in Ireland, also they impose English as the administrative language in India, replacing Persian with English in, I think it was called the Anglicist policies of 1835 to 1837. So those are two crucial years when English replaces Persian. And so that is the reach of, in a way, the colonial culture. Whereas in the pre-modern period, you had a high court culture, but people at the lower levels, at the agrarian level, they were kind of left, and the state didn't intervene in their lives to a same extent. So I think that's all really important. But also going back to your response about the imperialist complex, I think a strange thing, a kind of an ironic or paradoxical thing that has happened is that we both, and not just Iranians, we're talking about, you know, Turks and even Arabs and Central Asians, Indians, we've had an inferiority complex after Western colonialism, thinking that we're inferior, and that's why, you know, we are in a weaker position materially and politically and technologically and in terms of wealth. But then, at least in Iran, there has been a superiority complex that developed jointly with the inferiority complex. So the idea is that we are inferior because, you know, say, I mean, this is a nationalist, the Aryanist nationalist discourse of the late 19th century, that we're inferior because, you know, Arabs came to us and we lost our pre-Islamic Iranian and Iranian glory. So we also have a superiority complex that you said. We have this nostalgia or regret over our past. And then in the past we were superior. And then what's interesting is that this actually gets extended because even though we're inferior in relation to the Europeans and the Westerners, there is still this idea in Iran that, well, we're somehow superior to, say, Central Asians or to the Afghanistanis because, you know, they don't have it, you know, they don't have independence. They never had a state. They never had, you know, a culture. And it's always been the Iranian culture that's been kind of morphing all of it. And so in a sense, it's this paradoxical superiority complex that overtakes, but it gets applied mostly to our neighbors.
Yeah, one thing you mentioned, I think I hate to always digress, but I can't. Your points are so fascinating. I can't not help but respond to them. It's so important to emphasize this. I heard an Arab say this, like the Ottoman, the history of the Arab countries. He said the Turks ruled Arab countries for 500 years, and no one in North Africa speaks Turkish, right? They ruled Algeria. Where are the Turkish-speaking people in Algeria? But the French ruled Algeria for barely a century, and they still speak French there. How come no one speaks Turkish in Lebanon, but they all speak French and English? In India, the Persian-speaking people entered India with Mahmud al-Ghaznavi in almost the year 1000, and the Mughal emperor was dethroned finally in 1850 something with the mutiny, the very last. So we had from 1000 to 1850, 850 years of Persianate rule, and no one speaks Persian as a native language hardly in India. But the British were there for 200 years practically, in reality, 200 years of true rule in India, and everyone speaks English. So how can we compare the two situations? And now to the point of the inferiority and superiority complex, I hate that this is true, but not everything the Orientalists say about us is false. I'm sure you'll roll your eyes, but the whole point of Iran is a country of contradictions. There is truth to it. Right now, the way it's phrased is Orientalist, of course. But the reality behind it is that Iranians are in this transitionary period. So the way it's phrased, Iran is the land of contradictions. It's Orientalist. But the truth is that Iran is transitioning from pre-modernity to modernity. It's negotiating the status of religion in the modern Muslim context. It's trying to deal with so many things. It's modernizing its economy, and the society is changing. And Iranians have also been thrust back and forth ideologically. We have whiplash. We went from being a classic pre-modern Islamic society, and then the Pahlavis came and gave us all this Aryanism that you mentioned and nostalgia for the pre-modern Persians, and said that Arabs and Turks and Afghans are backwards and Islam is backwards. And then the Islamic Republic came and said, oh, actually, no, that was a mistake. We don't believe that. We're Muslims again, guys. We're a Muslim country. So Iranians have had whiplash. Their neck is flung back and forth. So there's this joke, but there's a lot of truth to it, that Iranians, the same Iranian in my snap rides that I take in Tehran, will say something deeply Islamophobic, and then they'll also say something very Islamic at the same time.
Yeah.
So in the beginning of the ride, they'll say, excuse me, I see you're religious, but what's with this Islamic stuff that you guys have? Islam is an Arab religion. Islam is backwards. It's old. And then I'll talk to him about Islam, and he's Islamophobic, right? Then at the end of the ride, we start talking about life in America, and he'll say, my cousin went there. The people don't cover themselves properly, and they don't wash themselves in the Islamic way, and they eat pork. It's very dirty. It's not proper the way they are. They're Musalmun nistan. They're not Muslims like us. The same person who earlier is saying that Islam is backwards and Arabs are backwards and the desert is where backwardsness is and Iran is a modern country. At the end of the taxi ride, he's telling me that Europeans are backwards because they're not following Islamic etiquettes.
Yeah.
Well, البته ما ایرانی‌ها we Iranians are more civilized, of
Yeah,
course.
and
The same person will say.
And if you don't see the contradictions in Iran as such, you definitely see it in Snap and in the taxi rides. But yeah, so I mean, you mentioned how there was this Aryanist narrative, say in the late 19th century, early 20th century, that blamed Iran's supposed decline and inferiority compared to the West on the Arabs. I was curious about this. So have you seen anti-Arab sentiment in classical Persian literature, or is this something that's new?
No, it's very rare. So what you can call anti-Arab sentiment is anti-Bedouin sentiment usually, and it's inherited from the Arabs themselves. The tradition of making fun of Bedouin or saying that they're unsophisticated, specifically the Arabs that live in the desert, right, that aren't settled. So really it amounts to, what I see is the sentiment is about civilized versus uncivilized. And this is using Arab terms, by the way. I reject this notion that they are uncivilized. But the Arabs themselves say Hadar, civilizational Arabs, and Bedouins. So pre-modern people they didn't view identity strictly along ethnic lines. Of course, those existed, right? Rumi calls himself a Tajik. Sadi says he's Fars, etc. But they viewed kinship ultimately as more relating to religion and shared settings, right? So if you're a city person, you dwell in a city and you're a Muslim, you have more in common with a Turkish or an Arab city Muslim than with a nomadic Turk or a nomadic Iranian person, which we don't have them anymore, but they existed, nomadic Iranic tribes, and a nomadic Arab, right? So it was more about not necessarily what ethnicity you are, or country you're from, but what type of civilizational reality you inhabit. So the idea of course, this beautiful concept of this explanation of imagined communities in the famous book, right? This idea of an imagined community where everyone in Turkey is the same because they're Turks, right? This didn't exist then. It was more about being from a city.
That's right. The city was
So if
very
you're
important,
from-
and that's why it was in the names too, like Shirazi, Shushtari,
Exactly.
Asfahani.
Absolutely, very important. And we still have these mindsets. Iran is not a fully modernized country in terms of people's mindsets. Now, the country is modernized. We have freeways and airports and factories and 5G internet. The trappings are there. But our mindsets have the ideological conditioning started later. European modernization, the philosophical project began in the 1700s, right? The starts were even earlier.
And ours is in the
inklings.
late 19th century.
Right. So Iranians, they still give a lot of credence to this. We still talk about, a girl should marry a Shirazi, Turkish girl should marry a Persian boy, a Persian man should marry a Turkish girl, but this thing, or Shirazis are like this, and Mashhadis. So we still even have these notions that people from different parts of Iran their personality, their temperament is different in the way that modernized countries don't have it as much. So Iranians still inhabit this. We're at the very end of it almost. I mourn it. But we still have many of these pre-modern memories and mindsets that have been passed down.
That's right. And so I think I very much agree with you on here that the pre-modern perception towards Arabs by Iranians and Persian writers and speakers was different than the modern. And we mentioned in the 19th century as this development of an anti-Arab discourse in Iran and also outside Iran by Persian writers that's very much racialized under the influence of European racial categories. But could you also talk about the Arab perceptions towards Iranians, whether pre-modern or modern?
Yeah, unfortunately, I haven't done enough digging into the pre-modern canon. My perception is that initially there was a sense that Persians came from a civilization that was developed and fleshed out and a huge empire, and there was a sense of respect for what Persians had. So when you look at the Hadith tradition, people debate whether these things are valid or not. But there is this famous Hadith where the Prophet ﷺ says, وَلَوْ كَانَ الْعِلْمِ فِي الثُّرَيَّا فَلَيَنَالُهُ رِجَالٌ مِّن بَلَدِ Salman, or something like that. If the knowledge was in the Pleiades, if knowledge was in the skies, the people of Salman's country, Salman al-Farsi, would go find it. There was this reverence for Persian wisdom that Salman dug the trenches in the Battle of Khandaq, that they were from a civilization that was developed. And that persisted even until the Abbasid era. The court was full of Persians, and Persians were administering it, and Persians were writing all these books in Arabic. I think later on Arabs developed, they kind of went their own way. They came out of our yoke, so to speak. But there was always this sense of mutual respect, that Persians were respected for their great civilizational past, and that Arabs were respected for being the custodians of the religion of Islam and the language of Islam and the origin of Islamicness, so to speak. Not that it's necessarily an Arab thing, but there was some of that. And I think in the modern world, even still, this persists among many. There is a sense that Iran is a great civilization. And I've been told this even by Sunni Arabs in places like Jordan, where anti-Iranian sentiment exists, where a guy says, Bila mujamila, entum ahlul thaqafa wal hadar, and all these things. He says, without ta'aruf, in his own Arab way, mujamila, of saying it, you are people of civilization and culture and history, and he said, al-raqam, despite all of the problems that our countries may have, right? So there's a lot of recognition from Arabs of this Islamic, and you see it in Arab countries, the Nastaliq writing on the walls, their love for Rumi and our Persian poets. They're influenced by the Ottomans, who themselves are influenced by the Persians. But unfortunately, modern politics and nationalisms have strained these relationships. So if you say something which to me is an obvious statement, that Iraq is a Persianate country, to me seems obvious. But this is very politically and culturally problematic to say now, because of modern nationalisms. Even though Iraq is our backyard. I mean, Baghdad means God-given. Baghdad. What bigger sign than that do we need? That Iraq is right in our backyard, besides Tagh Kasra, which is outside of Baghdad.
That's right.
But if you say Iraq is a Persianate country, that sets off alarm bells in people's minds. Oh, you're an Iranian imperialist.
That's right.
You're an Arab hater. You hate Arabs.
Yeah, I think it just kind of depends. It's going to depend on how you phrase it. And yeah, like you're saying, there are certain sensitivities that you have to be careful about, so that they don't think that what you're saying is coming from that imperialist complex or the desire to control or being dominant over someone. Rather, it's more about that common cultural past and that common religious past or whatever it may be. And so let's close with my last question that's related to the last one. So he said something very interesting, that because in the Western mainstream media, the way they represent it, it is as if Arabs and Iranians have a very major conflict. I mean, they talk about the axis of resistance, and there are Arabs and Iranians in the axis of resistance. But outside of that, especially when it comes to the Sunni world, there's this narrative that Iranians and Arabs have an enmity. But you're saying that they extend respect, and this was my experience actually going to Uzbekistan. And also I think it's true in Pakistan, that they extend a lot of respect to Iranians and Persian culture. So could you also speak about our relationship with the Persianite sphere, so Central Asia and South Asia specifically, and our present relationship? And you could talk about the past too, if you like, but also our present relationship with the Persianite sphere. Our meaning the Iranians.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, Iranians, we inhabited a cultural realm that spanned from the Balkans all the way to Bengal. So anywhere you went in these places, the high culture, the religious culture, was either Persian or highly Persianized. So even you look at Turkish emerges as its own language of literature, but Ottoman Turkish is still highly Persianized, right? The words, the concepts, the ideas, the architecture, the mosques, the clothes, almost every facet of high culture. I mean, even the food in India, biryani, chai, naan. I mean, look at, these are all just Persian names, right? Was highly influenced. It's a mix, right? Persians come and they mix with the locals and they produce something beautiful like biryani. So we inhabited this cultural realm where, now Iranians, if they want to leave because everything is in the West now, they go to Europe or somewhere. But back then, if Iranians wanted to seek opportunities, they would go to Delhi.
Yeah, and when Iranians say that I want to go to Kharij, which both in Arabic and Persian means the outside is always the West. So if they go to India, it's not the outside, but it's just India.
It's not Kharij, really. Right, yeah, exactly. So we lived in this, this transnational Persianate realm that unfortunately it was destroyed by various changes that happened in the early modern era and then in the 19th and 20th centuries. But we had a huge cultural realm, and unfortunately it's been forgotten and underemphasized. And this is something that people in Iran and outside of Iran need to look back at and see as a bridge, a cultural bridge, a way to create ties and to have an amicable relationship with our neighboring countries like Turkey, Afghanistan, which we've had, good and bad moments with over the years, like all countries do, but as a way to strengthen our ties. So instead of fighting with Afghanistan and Turkey about who owns Rumi, to flip it and say, why don't we just celebrate that we share this heritage, that we're all passionate about the same heritage, right? So why don't we use this as a bridge? Now, this has been a shortcoming on our part and on their parts. And it's hard to blame anyone, right? The modern world shook us all up. But it's really important to look at this history to remind us of a time when Islam unified us, of when we were together instead of being pitted by outside forces, of when we enjoyed a high culture. The modern world has really degraded things so much, a time when instead of looking at TikTok, we were reading poetry. So many beautiful things can come out of just looking back at what unites us in our history, right? It's not for nothing that Hafez, he talks about Samarkand and Bukhara, right? Why does
I
Hafiz
get.
talk about Baghdad
Yeah.
and Samarkand and Bukhara and Bengal? Because these are our backyard. These are our neighbors. These are our relatives. We come from these places. Wasn't there that famous Persian poet who says, maybe I'm descended from a woman who would walk the streets in Samarkand or something to that
Oh,
effect, or
Sohrab
Baghdad or
Sapahri.
something like.
Sohrab
There you
Sapahri.
go.
Yeah.
Yeah, so even our thinkers, even in the modern era, were cognizant of this, that we are
right.
children of many places. We're not just related to this one country. When you go to Central Asia and they say, oh, we have a lot of Iranians here, and you go and you find a 12-er mosque where they all say, oh, we're Iranian, we've been living here for 300 years. How can we forget those people? How can we act like they're foreign to us? They're not, they're us.
Although we could say that Iran's is Uzbekistan's or Afghanistan's or India's backyard, right? We could also flip it.
Well, of course, yeah. This is from our perspective. As in, I don't mean backyard as in like they're subordinate anyway. As in like they're right next door. That's why I said I changed it to neighbor.
Right.
So
No,
sorry,
also it's a funny
native
word.
English speaker, but
No, it's a funny word because I think it was actually an American imperialist term applied to Latin America that they would say that Latin America.
okay, then I don't mean it in the imperialist way. Then God forbid. No, what I mean is that these people are, let's say, our front door. We open the door and we look across the street. We see Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan. These are our neighbors. We have a shared history. So many of our greats are buried in those countries. Right? I go to Konya to see Rumi, and one day I'll hope to go to Turkmenistan to see Abu Said Abu al-Khair, and I'll go to Delhi to see Nizamuddin Awliya and Amir Khosrow Dehlavi, these beautiful poets who wrote in Persian, right? They're all kin. We shouldn't behave as if we just happen to be here because of an accident of history. Or we shouldn't think that just because one is Shia and one's Sunni, that we should just be enemies and hate each other and ignore each other. Right? This is the wrong way to look at the situation. In my mind, we need to have direct flights with these countries. We need to remove visa restrictions. We need to bring students to study in Tehran and send students to study there.
That's right. Yeah, and I mean, I think what you say here is very interesting. Because these are like the little steps that we could take for unity. I mean, there were all these ideas of, say, pan-Islamic or pan-regional unity, starting from the 19th century, so the time that the impact of colonial modernity reached its heights, say in 1880 and thereafter. You had ideas on pan-Islamic unity, but none of them became operational because the structures, such as the nation-state, they're so strong that you can't really, I mean, you have an idea, but you can't really implement it. But even I think these little steps can be really good. So, if you have a US passport and an Iranian passport and traveling to, say, a neighboring country in Iran, I think it makes more sense to use your Iranian passport. Say, if both of them require visas, of course, then, you would maybe give your Iranian passport. So there's data that Iranians are actually traveling and engaging with the neighbors, and vice versa. If somebody from, say, Iraq has two passports, then I think it would be nicer to use the Iraqi passport to.
Well, the tragedy is that it's easier to go with an American one.
Yeah.
So I went to Pakistan, and my friend said, apply with an American passport, because if you apply with an Iranian one, you'll get greater scrutiny. Right. So I think the idea, like you said, the nation states are too entrenched to just get rid of them. I don't think anyone in Iran or Iraq would want us to be one country, but we can become like Europe. We can slowly lift visa restrictions. We can slowly integrate each other economically. We can allow people to have freedom of movement. And then the borders will become like the provinces of the past, because the Safavid and Ottoman and Mughal empires also had provinces. So if we can become so integrated to the point where we're like Europe, where the borders are just demarcations and ways of administering a place, but ultimately you can go back and forth, which we have, right? With Iraq, we have freedom of movement. With Turkey, we have freedom of movement. So we are integrated, but I think we should look eastward as well and try to do the same with our neighbors to the east, with Pakistan, with Turkmenistan is just, who knows what's going on there. Why don't we integrate with them more? Why don't we have back and forth with them? With countries in Central Asia like Samarkand and Bukhara. But it's starting. I see it on Iranian Instagram. Our version of TikTok is on Instagram, right? You go there. Ma dar Bukhara hastim shahr farsi zaban, like the travel vloggers. We're in Bukhara, a Persian-speaking city. And the comments say, wow, they speak Farsi. They're amazing. So it's starting.
Yeah, it's starting, and I hope that it develops and expand in future years. Of course, assuming that that is a good value that should be sought out. But I think here is a great ending point. So thank you very much, Mohammad Ali Mojaradi, the founder of Persian Poetics, for the great conversation and all the really gems that we learned today from you about Persian literature and the broader issues on politics and culture. Thank you, Mohammad Ali Jan.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.